never stop learning, ask for help, and it's always contained. There's always something around the corner that you don't know, and just never stop learning. Always seek out opportunities.
Hello, and welcome to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. This is where we share stories for inspiration, entertainment, and encouragement because we all know emergency nurses have the best stories. Now, here's your host, Kevin McFarland.
Hey everybody, this is Kevin McFarland from the Art of Emergency Nursing, and thanks as always for listening to this podcast. I appreciate you downloading this episode. As I always say, don't forget to share this podcast with a friend. Make sure that you leave a rating and review. That's a great way to help the show out and help people discover this show. We really appreciate you doing that. I have a great episode for you today. In this episode, a friend of mine talks about her experience as a nurse and mentoring what might not be new nurses, but new nurses to your department, like travelers who are coming in. She does a great job talking about that. And we're going to speak a little bit about her experience with peds because she's a bit of a peds expert. So enjoy this episode with my friend, Mindy.
Wow, hello everybody. My name is Mindy Elayda. I'm from Northern California. I've been an ER nurse for over 24 years. I've experienced in psych nursing, med-surg, tele, trauma nursing, home health, pediatrics, and pediatrics in the ER is my favorite. And I know I've worked for many health systems, and I think being a traveler for 7 years really pretty much solidified as far as my experience in being flexible and adaptable. And as far as being a traveler, I've met so many people and networking, which also helped as far as my ENA role with Sacramento chapter and previously the San Francisco ENA chapter, where I worked heavily with Cheryl Randolph creating TraumaCon conferences. And I have recently helped the San Francisco ENA chapter with their last TraumaCon. They call it the ROSC of TraumaCon.
It was a great
And
conference.
yeah, every single conference we've held, we're 100% sold out.
That's awesome. What made you decide to get into nursing?
I got into nursing because my uncle is a cardiologist and my aunt is a pediatrician. And I did have an affinity for sciences. I love science. I actually enjoyed physics a lot in high school. And I gravitated toward that just because I had family members that were in the healthcare system. And originally, my original path was what I really wanted to do theater. But I found out after getting in a conservatory program that I don't think I could actually take this seriously as a full-time career, and the fear of being a waitress for the rest of my life, because I really enjoyed acting, but I'm glad I flipped back to nursing. And 24 years later, I'm still bedside and still enjoying it. I
That's
have
awesome.
thought about, changing it up, but for right now, I'm still enjoying it. I've been teaching at work for our skills and new hires. And then I really enjoy just mentoring our new hires at work because we have a very large ER. I may be in one pod and the other person in the other pod, but they'll come across the way and ask me questions. So pretty much all the nurses that I've been teaching, I pretty much have adopted. So, and it's great feeling to see them succeed, and I'll check on them. How's it going? Because, it's going from like a EMR as Cerna going to Epic. That's a big change, or they've never seen Epic in their life. It's a big deal, especially if you're a nurse over 10 years and you're into a brand new health system, an HMO health system versus a private entity or standalone. So we've had some people come from all the way from the Midwest. So it's been a great joy as far as mentoring these new hires that are not necessarily new grads, but just trying to help them get through the day and have a point person as far as a resource and a friendly resource.
I think that's really important. It's one of the things, when you come on and this, I think this happens to our travelers a lot because you come on and you expect them to be experienced nurses and they get kind of thrown to the wolves pretty quick. But they very well may be looking at a new EMR. They're looking at a new place. I mean, they don't even know where the restrooms are, for God's sakes. And
Yeah,
it's hard. Like it's hard to be new in that environment. It's a tough job. So I think that, it's important to be kind to those guys and try to mentor those folks a little bit, even though they are experienced nurses, that, they're not experienced at your place. And everybody has, everyone's place does things just a little bit different.
absolutely. Because I had a new grad and he was really concerned about our high volume of pediatric. He goes, "Well, at my last hospital," and I had to redirect him like, "You have to remember you're in a brand new culture, brand new ER. You're gonna have to like forget what you did at your last year. You're gonna have to brace this culture and
Mm.
see what we do. See how it goes. I'm gonna follow up with you in a couple weeks, see how's it going." And currently right now he's thriving. He's doing really well, exceptionally well. I believe he's been a nurse for only, I believe, maybe 2 or 3 years. So he's doing really well because I said, you're going from Cerna to Epic. It's a whole
A big
different kind of
change.
computer system. And I've used, as a traveler, I did a lot of EMR conversions. So I know the battle of there's always another way of doing things. There's the one way, and then there's the other way, but neither of them are going to be incorrect. It just as far as your flow. And there's
Yep.
some things that are going to be a hard, like mandatory. I think that's the challenge of EMR charts versus, I did my whole part of my career with paper. And I can remember, there'd be 12-hour shifts where like I didn't write anything down and it's 6:30 PM. I remember those days. You're like, oh boy, or you lost that one piece of paper for the code and you just can't remember when you gave it. You're just trying to reinvent the wheel. Like, where's that, where's that note on the sheet?
But we talked about that. I was talking to some nurses today or the other day about that. About they were saying how when Cerner went down and then all of a sudden they had to do paper charting, they were like, "Oh my god, we were here forever." Had cramps in our hands because we were writing all this stuff down. I'm like, that used to be how we did it. Like that's
That's what we did.
like I'm
And
old enough to know. I'm old enough to remember that. And I wasn't a nurse when we were an electronic by the time I became a nurse, but I worked as a tech in the ER. And I remember many a days of writing by hand on all these paper charts. So it's certainly it's a different gig than what nurses now are used to.
yeah, so in addition to my real job, I do volunteer for RockMed, and RockMed is a volunteer organization for music festivals, concerts, and the charting is all paper. So I remember for the last festival in San Francisco, we had 6 new grads. A lot of them freshly graduated 2 months out, 3 months out, and to do paper charting, it's just this little square rectangle, squeeze it all in. And, I had to tell them, you got to know where you put it, what side. And it was really great to see them thrive because I'm like, you're licensed now. You can start IVs. And and I show them as far as some of the catheters. You'll find that every nurse has their own thing. Eventually, you'll have to develop your own kind of style.
Yep.
And I remember I used to tell this nurse because those old days when the sharp was really sharp, I remember I just followed my preceptor and I just would stab the sharp in the bed. Those
Oh,
days. When they
oh,
yeah, when those yeah, I know.
I
Ruin the
remember
math.
I
Yes.
remember seeing people do that. I remember seeing people, they get the sharp out before we had the retractable blades, they just stick it in the bed and you're like going, "Oh my god, like, please don't do that."
I
And,
know, and then after a while, you do the bed and you're like, "Wow, there's a lot of holes in the bed there."
oh my god, like, how gross is that? I remember watching people do that, like, even, before we had the safety catheters where they self-sheath
Yes.
and stuff,
They were
um,
sharp, and I
they
didn't
were sharp
I mean I
and,
mean, it's legit sharp, so
and I remember I don't know how many times I'd always see what I would always do is I'd always drop it on the floor and put my foot on it. Um, but I remember seeing somebody stick it into the bed, and then one day we took off the mattress pad off the bed
oh
and exposed just the foam. And it had
gosh,
all
that's
these little like
cute.
red pock marks, and like you would see like mold right there, bacteria right
Oh,
there. It's like,
no, 'cause,
oh,
like, it's con you didn't think about back then, but, I just did what my mentor showed me. He goes, "This is how you don't get stuck." I'm like, "Okay." So, you
yeah,
follow your mentor, and I'm like, "Oh, that works out." So you 'cause, it's really sharp. Because I remember when I had a brief hiatus when I became a medical equipment consultant, and at the corporate level, I just remember took a travel assignment after being off for a year. I didn't know these catheters when I was working in Arizona had a blunt tip because I was trying to stab it in the bed, and they're like, "Oh, no, you can't do that. See it? It's kinda blunt, right over there." So, I was like, "Oh,
Yep.
goodness.
Yeah, you're
Alrighty.
like,
So, you can't stab it in the bed. There's a blunt tip. Don't see it? It's a safety needle." I'm like, "Oh." And then, of course, my very first patient after being gone for a year was a STEMI from the field. So and then after 4 hours, I remember because I was a traveler, my preceptor goes, "Oh, Mindy, you don't need me. You've rocked the last 4 hours. You don't need any more orientation." I'm like, "Yes, I do." I'm like, "I I've been away from the bedside for a year." I'm like and she said, "I can't even tell that you've been gone away from here. It's you don't need me." I'm like, "I still get my 2 days of orientation." And so basically she just kinda let me do my thing, and it was great because 'cause I've had travel assignments where I'm on orientation. They had to pull my preceptor and I was left alone. So having those kind of days really toughened up my critical thinking and skills and being in a new place, contract wise and just trying to embrace the culture.
yep.
So that really strengthened my skills after doing that for several years.
I remember as a new grad nurse, I was a new grad nurse in the hospital where I worked as a tech for years. And there was a couple of nurses like, "Oh, you already know all this stuff." I'm like, "Treat me like I don't know. Treat me like I don't know anything." So, well, there may be some stuff I know. There's a lot of stuff I don't know.
Yeah. They're like, "Oh,
So,
you're fine." Because I remember when I worked in Tucson, I would work registry. I was so tickled by they would give me 3 critical rooms with a paramedic. I was like, "What is this fanciness?" I was like, "This is exciting." So,
yeah,
I that was my favorite story as far as being a traveler because we don't have paramedics that work as paramedics in the ERs in Northern California. So I told him it's not something that we do. We're pretty much nursing union heavy in Northern California, and that's not something that we could practice. I would love it because I found as far as the turnover, the paramedic that worked in the ER, they were also in nursing school.
mhm,
So pretty much when they graduate, they just roll another medic in that's in the nursing program ideally. So
yep,
it was great. They always had a paramedic in a critical care zone and then also a paramedic in the trauma room. And I thought that
yep,
was fantastic. It was
yeah.
great because they function everything underneath their license. They transported for me. They just can't do the meds, but I thought it was the greatest thing ever, so I kept picking up extra shifts there because it was great. They said no matter what, if they're core staffing, they would always pick me up, and they actually the registry would call, "Is Mindy available?" And like, "No, she's at her other job." It
That's
was very
funny.
flattering, and I still have a lot of close friends in Arizona to this day, so I'm
I
really
bet.
lucky that we've all stayed in touch.
I bet. I bet. So tell me about a patient that changed the way you practice.
I really believe there's this patient that I had long ago. He was elder, probably in his 60s or 70s. And, a lot of the vets do wear their hats as far as, or especially this guy was a Navy guy. He had his old ship on his hat. And growing up military, I'm very familiar with the military healthcare system. And he did become ICU, and I talked to him and chatted up for a little bit, and I was discussing because he was really worried about his wife in case he did pass because he was very critical at the moment, and I said, "Are you getting your medications through TRICARE?" Which is the military health insurance. He's like, "What are you talking about? The base closed." I'm like, "The base might have closed, but it's still open. The VA clinic is open." And he was so flabbergasted because he had no idea that he could use these healthcare services available to TRICARE. So at the end of my shift, I printed out the resources available to him as a vet. And I told him, "You've missed out because you've been paying more than you needed to on your cardiac medications." I know about this because I grew up military. I was a military brat for most of my career until I got done with being kicked off for after college. So as a former military brat, I coached him as far as what he needed to do, dial the phone numbers, and the next day at work, he thanked me so graciously for getting him dialed in for services, getting him proper housing for his wife, because he was really concerned that if he passed in the hospital, his wife would be homeless. But
Wow.
it tickled me so much the next day because I knew that I talked to the discharge planners, and they are not familiar as far as military healthcare and also when they're retired. So I dialed them in, and that really impacted me as far as how I see people, what their background, especially vets. I have a really soft spot for vets as far as getting them their help that they need. And I was just really shocked that still to this day, he goes, I had no idea these services were available. I thought that when the base was closed, that was it. So he was so grateful. He was still I see him the next day. He did finally get a room,
Yeah.
but it was just really touched that one of the ER techs told me, "Your patient from yesterday who would like to talk to you." I was like, "Oh, okay." And of course, I was kinda sad that he's been in ICU hold all night long, but
Yeah.
he was just quite tickled, still wearing his cool little veteran hat, and he goes, "Thank you so much, Mindy. I just feel so much at ease in case something happens to me. My wife will be taken care of because I've been so worried about her because it's just been her and I out here and their kids are like far away." But that really impacted me as far, like, taking time, getting to know the patient's background, culture, and knowing what I know and trying to pass it on to the discharge planners that are there to let them know that some of these vets, they don't know that they do have other resources available despite the bases closing. So that really impacted me and made a big difference as far as um, making a better way in case he does pass for his wife.
Nice. Very cool. That's great. And it's amazing sometimes how the lack of knowledge that people have of their healthcare, their insurance, what they have the availability to, and their disease processes, the whole nine. Like
Hmm.
people, like it's like healthcare is like just this giant mystery to them sometimes.
Yeah. And, because since I know he was like not technology savvy, I just printed out all this information for him. Here, call this 800 number. And then they were able to give him a landline phone, and he was so tickled. I mean, he was just so appreciative, and just his big smile was just a reward enough. And he thanked me so much. So taking care of him, and as far as the long term, because ICU holds are unfortunately a reality everywhere, tele
Sure.
holds, but getting somebody help them with far as their lack of knowledge as far the other options, because as far as health insurance, it's not part of our job as an ER nurse, but as far as helping someone out with my knowledge, knowing that kind of background that I've had growing up just really made a difference.
That's awesome. Very cool. You tell me about the first time you made a medical error?
Well, the first time I made a medical error, I was horrified about it, and I did, self-report it. It was very early in my career, and, I was terrified to report it, but I did it anyway because that's the right thing to do, and I just remember just sweating pins in my heart as far as what was going on, but other than that, I felt very supported as a new nurse, and my colleagues that are like, "Mistakes happen, you're new, I'm glad you caught it." And I was able to recover from that, and I know that's for any new nurse, it's, like, horrifying to know that you made a mistake,
Yeah.
and now that we've got EMRs that you have to scan the meds, you can still make a mistake, though. I mean, you could still pull the wrong med from the Pyxis, it could look everything's looks similar. Those little cups, you're getting maybe chlorhexidine mouthwash, but you grab, like, viscous Lidl because the cups are really similar, but it can happen to anybody. But I think being self-awareness and actualization, knowing that we're all human and it was a near miss, and I learned a lot from that mistake. So,
I bet.
it was
I bet.
terrifying, terrifying,
It's
absolutely
always
terrifying.
it's always scary, and I mean, they come up with all these great things to prevent, medical errors, and they can still happen. Um, but what I see a lot is, the when sometimes when I see errors happen, it's because somebody has gone out of their way to work around the safety features, right? Like, so
Right.
yeah, someone has gone through and, not scan the meds, or not scan the patient, or they have the patient's wristband on their cart and not scanning on the patient, but scanning on the cart. And you're just like going, this is how mistakes happen. So,
Because I remember it was back in the day before Pyxis existed, it was like open stock meds. And it just, I was on a trauma floor back then, but, there's no Pyxis, old school way of, wasting your narcotics on a big piece of paper. Now it's different, but I tell people like, well, you know what? Yes, you have never done paper charting, but you're on night shift, and you know what? You will have sometimes unscheduled downtime. Something
yep,
you'll have to remember when you work night shift. And they're like, what? I'm like, yes, that's pretty much everywhere. Downtime's always on night shift.
yep,
And
yep,
you have to be really careful because you're going to be switching to paper charting.
yep,
And that's a lot because I just remember when you transfer somebody, because, it's triplicates. And I remember I had a doctor's, discharge instruction memorized. It kinda went like, "Return if worse in any which way, temperature over 101.3, please follow up with your primary care doctor or come back to the ER." And because I remember, it was a verbal order and you, like, sign it. Those are those great old days where they would dictate to you, "I'm in a code, can you just write this for me?" "Okay."
yep,
And, there's no phones, no Sarah, you had to actually walk up to them. "Okay, I got it." I'm like, because you pretty much would have a lot of the doctor's discharge instructions memorized after a while, so especially if they were in a critical patient. Those are
yep,
great old days. I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this back to you, and you have to write, read back, sign,
yep,
date, time.
yep, yep,
Those good old
exactly,
days. So other than that,
exactly.
I've come a long way. It's like crazy. I 24 years in as far
Yep,
as being an ER nurse.
yep. It's a long time. It's a long
Mhm.
time. What's the best advice a mentor ever gave you?
I think the best advice my mentor ever gave me is never stop learning, ask for help, and it's always contained. There's always something around the corner that you don't know, and just never stop learning. Always seek out opportunities, and that's what ENA's done for me as far as wanting to get more involved because I getting onto my first committee, a national committee, and then becoming committee chair. That was huge for me. That really opened my eyes as far as what's available than just being, paying my annual dues. And it really branched me out from just being a chapter board member.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing the opportunities that are out there if you just look for them.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. My early mentor, she was one of those ICU ER nurses, so I learned a lot from her.
I bet. I bet. What advice do you give new nurses coming into the emergency department for the first time? Like, say they were a med surge nurse or a tele nurse. What advice do you give them transitioning into that emergency department role?
I think for those that are cross training into that role, I think the whole big thing is knowing that it's a faster paced environment. Things constantly change, and just to prepare themselves by looking at resources that are available to them because as far as they may not get the same patients all the time. It's always going to be different. And we're dealing with all ages because I often come across some nurses that have very little peds experience.
Mhm.
And then I offer them the resources that are available to them in addition to my PowerPoint. And again, I do promote ENA as far as the books that are available, the programs that are available to get a launch started. I do implement as far as the pediatric nursing process in my PowerPoint and just telling, you may not be a brand new nurse, but being new to the ER, you're dealing with all ages and you never know what you're going to get. And there's going to be standing protocols that you're not be used to that you never did on med surge or ICU. Cause I know some ICU nurses sometimes don't transition well, especially, you see them doing a head to toe on a toe pain. And, and I'm like, oh, they're okay. And I'm like,
Yeah.
um, or, trying to do a full assessment on a ESA 5, and I think I just tell them, "It's just a whole new world." It's kinda like that Aladdin song. It's a whole new world, and you just gotta be able to embrace it and realize you could be sitting for, like, maybe an hour or so, or you're gonna be on your feet, rocking it, and it's just gonna be dynamic changing. It's very fast paced and be ready for anything that comes to the door, and I was very frank about telling the peds new hires if I did show one of the new hires a pediatric resource book that I have, and she totally started ordering it on her break. I was so tickled by that. And she found me the next day when she's on the floor. She goes, Mindy, I got the book. I'm so excited. Because where our hospital is, the pediatric patients go to the sister hospital across town. So she was really excited for the resource.
What book? I'm curious. What book was it that you recommended?
It's the Rapid Access Guide for Pediatric Emergencies. And when you flip to any kind of condition, it's got the signs and systems, the interventions, any kind of miscellaneous tips about it.
That's
So
awesome.
because I told them, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. This resource is perfect for you. It's hot off the press. And they wrote it during the pandemic. So, and because I remember seeing it on Facebook, I'm like, oh, I want to check that out. And I really enjoy it because it's a great resource to have. Because I don't know everything still after 24 years. There's a lot of things I can forget, but it's a great resource. So um, I'm just glad that, out of the 10 people I was teaching, one person is feeling motivated to just, be successful and get ready to go because she's been a nurse for a very long time, but peds is not her strong point. And I said, that's okay. We're here to support you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and I'm very transparent of like, here's my email, here's my text phone. If I'm not working, I'm okay with that. Just remember that I will get back to you as soon as I can. And then if you see me on the floor, I will do my best to help support you and be successful. And I think that's really important when you're teaching nurses from another health system to get to know our health system. And I always tell people, even though you've done Epic, you have to realize every health system's Epic is going to be a little bit different.
Everyone's
They have to
just a
tweak it.
little bit different. Mhm.
I was like, I told them half of the battle is trying to get your login to work. That's fine. Just getting
Right?
your login to work is half, and getting access. Some people had trouble with access for a week. I was like, oh, that's terrible. Okay, so they can't really do much, but their health stream's online.
Yeah, then you're kinda dead in the water.
Pretty much.
But yeah, it's funny how every hospital, they may still be Cerner or Epic, but
Uh-huh.
it may be a little bit different. I know the first hospital that I worked at in the emergency department had Cerner, and then the hospital I work at now has Cerner, but completely different. They look completely different. It's not even
I
close
yeah.
to the same.
Mm-mm.
Peds. So I'm gonna tweak my last question a little bit for
Okay.
peds, to kind of get more peds specific. But what are three things an emergency nurse should remember when taking care of a pediatric patient? What are three things they can just forget? Like it's not a thing, don't do it.
Um,
But specific
um,
peds.
specific for peds, I think the top three things they need to always remember. Number one, you got to get the weight. Number two, for peds, it is always going to be a package plan. They're going to be with grandmother, uncle, but it is a family plan. And it's never going to change.
Good point.
And it will get really complicated if you got stepmom, stepdad, or two sets of parents trying to vie for attention. But always remember it's a package deal. And then number three, being culturally sensitive for people that don't speak English. That's a huge thing. And knowing the cultural background from them. I think that's a big thing with peds is knowing as far as the diversity and always try to get an iPad translator because it's a state law in California. But knowing the cultural difference as far as pediatrics, how the parents are, what the practices are, being diverse. Because I know working in San Francisco, I would have to deal with maybe 7 or 8 different languages daily.
Yeah.
So I think that's the big thing with peds, knowing the cultural diversity of your department and your area.
Good point. It's a really good point.
Mhm.
What
And
and
then
what are three things they can just forget?
three things to forget. Forget about using estimated weight from the parents. If you don't know the weight, just use the Brazel tape. Just don't ever estimate the weight. That is going to put you down a bad rabbit hole. Forget about that. And then number two, just remember your legal laws as far as, when minors come in. Know the statute as far as getting consent, making sure they're not emancipated. But just be careful when the minors come in and then be suspicious. And I think it's a really big deal with human trafficking and then wondering if they're a runaway, any kind of psych issues. Second one, please do not use Coban on IVs. That's not a good thing. Coban on IVs, it's okay in the beginning, but that can create a problem later on because especially if it's too tight. Try to carefully wrap their IVs in a way where you can see the catheter because sometimes that Coban's too tight and that can be an issue. Just forget about using Coban on those IVs. It's a no-no. And number 3, if you're not unsure about a PEDS medication, you don't know how to syringe pump, please don't pretend that you know how to do it in front of the family. Please program that syringe pump outside of the room with a mentor. That is parents will be horrified if you're struggling with a syringe pump in the room and all these beeps are going because they're going to question your integrity, your professionalism. Always, always program the pump outside of the room.
It's like, that's actually great advice because I don't know how many times, I go in and I'm messing with the pumps and I just don't play with them enough that I'm like, I look like a brand new nurse every time I'm trying to mess with the pumps.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook.
I do make sure I teach that to everybody in my new hire peds class. Please program the pump and also plug it in, program it outside. If you can't remember, please get somebody else because fussing with that syringe, not no loading it properly, it's can be like a 30-minute nightmare. You remember parents will get concerned because you need to give that life-saving antibiotic, Tylenol, or whatever medication. It is a disaster because then they're going to question you. They will. Look, what are you doing? Because I remember I was kind of coach somebody. Okay, that child in there has got a Berviac. You've never done that before. So you have to remember these kids with these binders, they have protocols. They're special needs kids. They're going to check you and watch you and just be transparent. I've never accessed that before. You have another nurse going to help you so you can learn.
And they're going to know it better than you do.
Absolutely, because these are these oncology kids that these parents are having to deal with this daily on a daily basis, trying to keep a Broviac, intact on a 4-year-old, 5-year-old that's like, just wants to play. Hard
Yep.
enough it is.
Yep.
So that's some of my takeaway points. I'm like, don't pretend to know. It's all
Yeah.
bad.
There's some things you can fake, but boy, especially your special needs kids, the parents are going to spot that fake a mile away.
Oh, yes, yeah, can I tell people and this is something I question, like, "So how many people are comfortable with suctioning of pediatric trachs?" Crickets. I was like, "Okay, that's fine. Don't try it. Call RT, please, or find me, and we'll go over through, but just don't, try to do it at the same but or attempt it. Just don't."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook.